Okay, so final presentation is from the boss, Stephen Jivraj.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. You might have noticed that what we have presented today hasn't actually exclusively come from our neighbourhood project, and as I kind of briefly alluded to yesterday, that's because we've had quite a lot of issues in getting our data ready, specifically for this seminar, but just ready to do any analysis. So really, what Owen's just presented and what I'm going to present is really kind of where we're up to at this point. And before I start, I'd like to make reference to a couple of, or quite a few acknowledgements. Primarily the Liebe Trust for funding this project. Clearly wouldn't have happened without their support. But also to Owen, who the data that I'm going to present here, which is actually the linked data between the cohort study and the data that Paul and Owen discussed in their presentations, we've only had that data for 30 days, a month. Pretty much, and in that time Owen has done a sterling job in getting all of the analysis ready for this presentation, so a big thanks to Owen for that. But what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about whether childhood neighbourhood, and actually that's also a bit of a bit misadvertised, because we're not actually going to be talking about childhood neighbourhood. I'm going to be talking about neighbourhood at age 16. But it was our hope that we would actually build in Owen's uncertainty analysis and imputation of what the childhood experience of neighbourhood is for this presentation. But given our time restriction, we didn't have the enough time to do that. But I'm going to look to see whether neighbourhood at age 16 has a bearing on later life self-rated health. And as Owen alluded to, later life starting at about the age of 33 and onwards. Why are we looking at self-rated health? Well, as I described yesterday, a quantitative social scientist, and not really an epidemiologist, I really like this measure of self-rated health because it gives a kind of broad definition of someone's health. I'm sure pretty much everyone in this room is fully aware of how this is generally operationalized through a single item question which asks you how is your health in general, and you have predefined categories, and I'll show the ones that are specifically used in the data that we've used in our work later in the presentation. But I think it distinguishes people in a way that if potentially you have some form of health condition, maybe you have an issue in relation to blood pressure or whatever it may be, that doesn't necessarily determine about whether you think you have good or bad health. So potentially some people with a certain condition could potentially deem themselves as having good health, and some people with the absence of a condition could actually describe themselves as having poor health. So for that purpose, I like this measure, and I think it kind of builds into something which we're really interested in tackling on this project, which is not just in relation to health, but this broader concept of well-being. That said, I'm sure many of you, the epidemiologists in the room, will know that this measure of self-rated health is very strongly predictive of conditions, of morbidity, and also strongly predictive particularly of premature mortality. So again, I think there's a justified approach in using it for that reason. And self-rated health has been shown to be very well validated in the sense that over time, not necessarily among the same people over time, but when looking over time at the measurement in repeated cross-sectional surveys, people generally deem a question as meaning something very similar. And also subgroup validation has shown that different people in different occupational groups and different ethnic groups, again, use this measure in a very similar way. And one important point for our work is, I think, what self-rated health enables us to do is really distinguish the health amongst a fairly young adult population. Because if we were to use what's typically used as many conditions, maybe something like blood pressure, maybe something like diabetes, maybe even something, an objective measure like BMI, we wouldn't really be able to distinguish the young population in terms of having good or bad health in quite the same way as if we used a measure of self-rated health. At least I think that's the case. And then the second real big question for this work is, okay, well, so we're looking at self-rated health. Why are we interested in the neighbourhood at childhood, or as I said, the neighbourhood at age 16? And this really builds upon the life course epidemiology framework, which is very well used within the discipline now. UCL at the very forefront of that work, and that work suggests not necessarily in relation to neighbourhood, but what happens to you earlier in life has a bearing on what happens later in life. Although that approach, I don't think has been, at least within epidemiology, only very recently has been translated into what might happen in relation to the neighbourhood context or the area context. And Emily's work is obviously a step in the right direction in that regard. Another reason for focusing on child neighbourhood is that a lot of the empirical evidence supports the fact that actually where you live in childhood is particularly important in terms of later life outcomes, whether it be health or any other kind of social outcome, in the regards that in childhood, perhaps people experience the neighbourhood in a very different way. And I'm sure many of you who are very well versed in neighbourhood effects literature will be aware of Galster's model of what are the mechanisms of neighbourhood effects, so those being the social mechanisms, those being the environmental, the geographical and the institutional mechanisms. Well, I like to think about the social mechanisms probably being the kind of clearest way in which you can really demarcate a neighbourhood effect. And the social mechanisms are about the everyday interactions which you have with people in your neighbourhood, and that having some bearing on impacting on how you behave as a person, and ultimately maybe having an effect on health and other things. And I'm sure you can probably all kind of remember from your own life that those interactions are probably going to be more likely when you are young. It doesn't perhaps happen when you are older, like well, I guess most of us are. We probably don't have quite the same interactions with our neighbours as we did as when we were children. So I think from a theoretical point of view, it makes a lot more sense that you would expect people to be more adversely or maybe positively affected by their neighbourhood while they are young. And during childhood, maybe the expectation would be adolescence would be the most critical period. And so I think there's a strong theoretical underpinning for this, but there is also the empirical evidence. I think empirical evidence that looks at the effect of the neighbourhood over the life course, we've seen examples of that from Emily and also yesterday, tends to suggest that the childhood experience is important. And if you also look at the cross-sectional work which looks at outcomes at perhaps early adulthood and a neighbourhood effect of childhood, that I think tends to show that the effect is stronger when you look at very similar outcomes much later in life when you person's experience of neighbourhood contemporaneously to that outcome. So I think there's a strong theoretical and a strong empirical support for focusing on the neighbourhood in childhood. But what's known? I mean, we're not really kind of pioneers in this research area. There has been work done. In fact, what we are really adding to is in the UK context. I don't think there's really been any attempt to look at this idea of life course neighbourhood effects using data from a nationally representative cohort. Although there have been other studies that have done something very similar. In fact, what we're replicating really, if we're being brutally honest. And so, Anne Ellaway and colleagues have done work using the West of Scotland 07 study, I think it's called, which is a study of 3 cohorts. All, I think, were first interviewed late 1980s. One of the cohorts was, I think, about age 15, one was about age 35, and one was about age 55 at baseline. And these people have been followed through time and up to following a 20-year period. And during that time, they've had measures of their self-rated health measured, and at the baseline point, using, I think, their postcode sector, they're able to determine the level of neighbourhood deprivation that these people were experiencing. And so what you see on the slide here are the results of a growth curve model, which just shows the trajectories over time in people's probability of reporting poor self-rated health by the level of deprivation that they are experiencing, and for the 3 cohorts which are in this cohort study in Scotland. And what it shows is that really it's only at the older ages where we see this real kind of big difference in the baseline reporting or predicted probability of reporting self-rated health. And I think what's more interesting is what happens in terms of the fanning out of this probability by the level of deprivation that you're experiencing at baseline. So particularly for men, those who were in the most deprived neighbourhoods at baseline have seen a much faster accelerated increase in their probability of reporting poor self-rated health compared with those living in the least deprived neighbourhoods, who, although also, as we'd expect with people of this age, you would expect them to be getting more unhealthy, but by no means as quick as those living in the most disadvantaged neighbourhoods. Now, I think this analysis is really great, and in fact, this is really the kind of starting point for the analysis that I'm going to present. But I do think there are some issues with the work here, particularly in relation to things we've talked about yesterday in regards to selection. So we don't really know what's happened to these people prior to entering the study at this point, and it could have been the case that these people here were actually always on a trajectory of being more likely to report poor self-rated health, and they just happened to already have been selected into those most deprived neighbourhoods. And equally, I think you could make the same case for the age group here, and maybe less so, although we saw from Lena's presentation yesterday about intergenerational selection as well, that potentially could be something going on there too. Yesterday we also saw Ruth's work. Where's Ruth at the back there? I don't need to dwell upon what she talked about, but what Ruth did in relation to the work I showed on the previous slide is look at the separation between the childhood exposure and the adult outcome, again here in relation to self-rated health, over a much longer period of time. And Ruth showed us a very interesting partition of her variance between the school, neighbourhood, and family level. And I think Ruth, what you showed was really brilliant, really excellent, and kind of enabled you to look at the neighbourhood at a very early point in childhood, not just in the life course, and then look at the outcome at a very late stage of life. But I think potentially the previous paper kind of adds a little bit, and where we're also trying to do something similar, is to look at that change over time. So rather than just looking again at the ultimate ending point, we look at the self-rated health at one point in time during adulthood, and then seeing if that changes over time. And again, I think that kind of deals with this idea of selection as well, because I think with your work as well, Ruth, there could still be a situation here where, again, people were just moving to that level of self-rated health, irrespective of actually the neighbourhood that they are located at that point in time. Now, there is US literature which, specifically in relation to self-rated health, we also saw it from Philippa's presentation yesterday in relation to functional limitations and death, but specifically in relation to self-rated health, there are, again, very similar type of analysis. Here's work from, I think it's someone called Rocco Johnson, and what he does is uses a data set called the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, which, again, in contrast to Ruth's work, contrast to the Anne Alloway work, and also in contrast to what I'm going to present, is actually use not just one single birth cohort, or in relation to the West of Scotland study, 3 birth cohorts. They actually use a whole panel study of people across 20 years of age, and then track those people over time. In fact, I think they track them from 1968 up until the mid-2000s. And what's interesting here about the Johnson work is they find that the magnitude of the fixed effect of the neighbourhood is actually quite a lot bigger than what we saw in Ruth's analysis and what you can see in the Alloway analysis. And also the variation at the neighbourhood level, again, is considerably greater, or the proportion of variance partitioned across the levels of the model is considerably greater at the neighbourhood level than a lot of other analyses. Now, I should caveat that the way they fit their models here is not with a dichotomous or even a multinomial outcome of self-rated health, but they actually map the question of self-rated health as asked in the Panel Study of Income Dynamics onto a distribution of health between 0 and 100. So they're actually fitting linear growth models here and not logistical or ordinal growth curve models. So that may be kind of what's the result of having much greater variation at the neighbourhood level, and maybe what enables them to show these stronger effects. But this idea of selection, I think, is particularly problematic. Again, I could reverse the same kind of criticisms against the Johnson work in relation to selection. So The people that have tried to tackle that specifically in relation to self-rated health this is a good example from Mark Green, based at Liverpool, and his colleagues, that very recently published a paper where they look at what happens to people's self-rated health among those people who move, amongst what in the kind of UK literature is referred to as an internal migrant. I think Paul described this earlier, so someone moving subnationally. In this case, I think it's just within England. And what they look to see is the probability of reporting, I think again this is poor self-rated health, based upon the deprivation level, or the deprivation quintile of the neighbourhood which you move to. And they look at this over annual periods of following the migration, and I've just focused here on the longest period in which they look at this, and this is using data from the British Household Panel Study. And so these are the odds ratios 9 years after someone moves and 10 years after they moved. And this is the odds, again, of reporting poor self-rated health relative to moving to a neighbourhood which is defined as the least deprived quintile on their distribution. And what you can see here from the significance levels, from the p-value, is that there isn't a strong relationship. It doesn't matter if you moved to a more deprived neighbourhood, there doesn't appear to be a stronger association or a stronger prediction of having poor self-rated health. So when trying to deal with this problem of selection by using migrants, what they are suggesting is that the neighbourhood effect perhaps isn't as strong as many people would suggest. Now, summarising that literature and what else is known in relation to self-rated health, looking at the impact of neighbourhood over the life course, here are a couple of things that we've kind of identified as being problems or gaps in the literature, and kind of regurgitating a lot of things I've just said, but where the exposure is estimated at a particular point in childhood, I think that can be problematic. And as I've said, it's actually not something we're actually going to, today anyway, not going to solve in this paper, but with the work that Owen's described, that's something we will tackle at a later date. This second problem of unvalidated neighbourhood exposures, I think, is a problem, and I think it's a criticism that could really be levelled against this Green work, who, when they're defining their measure of neighbourhood here, they actually use house prices to determine the distribution of people into different quintiles. Now, house prices, I think we all agree, is probably not a very good measure of neighbourhood deprivation. You can think of the obvious reason, particularly in a city like London, where you have some areas where very high proportions of the housing stock in that place won't be in the private sector, and so won't be changing hands, and we won't have land registry data which has given you the cost of that housing. But the small proportion of housing in those places which is changing hands through the private market will be changing hands for maybe very high amounts of money. So you might actually be misclassifying some areas as being actually very affluent, when actually the high proportion of people living in those places are actually living in probably, at least relative to the actual rest of the area, quite low valued housing stock, although any housing stock in London would clearly be worth more than other places in the country. But the point I'm trying to make there is that it's perhaps not a very good measure of the neighbourhood, and certainly not a validated measure of the neighbourhood. And you could apply the same criticism maybe to the historic work that Ruth presented, but that's, and as kind of as Humphrey has said a couple of times over the course of the last 2 days, that these data are problematic going back in time to earlier censuses. So the reason why Paul's not calculated the Townsend going back to 61, going back to 51, is because the data just aren't really available to do so. So again, as a kind of word of the day, pragmatic decision to be made there. Also, I think setting your outcome at one point in time, I've talked about this, can be problematic. This issue of over or under specification of explanatory variables, I think can be problematic, and maybe I'm kind of sharpening all your knives here to attack you back, but this is maybe a criticism that I would kind of apply to what you presented, Philip, for that you have a whole range of explanatory variables, some which you could maybe argue as being mediators, but some which actually might be on the kind of causal pathway to ultimately your outcome, and therefore again you might be underestimating the neighbourhood effect, because actually it's the earlier neighbourhood that impacts on a lot of those things which you measure contemporaneously, which then ultimately impacts upon the outcome that you're measuring. So, I mean, anyone who does any form of statistical modelling knows that this is a kind of fine balancing act that we kind of never really get right, and you kind of have to justify what you do. And then I think in some ways kind of you can potentially overcomplicate your analysis by using too many different levels. And Ruth, I can kind of entirely see why you did what you did. And I think for me, what I took from your paper is a really interesting methodological exercise in showing what you can do and what you can show, and interesting to see how the variance is partitioned at the neighbourhood level. But one thing that I was thinking is that, and it's interesting you do that in the cross-classified model, but you can also think that the institutions, like the schools, can potentially affect everyone in the neighbourhood, not just the children that attend that school. So, for example, I don't have school-aged children, but the quality of the local schools may have an impact upon me individually, if we believe this idea that neighbourhoods through institutions have an effect. So simply kind of cross-classifying people on the basis of the school that they go to could be actually, again, kind of diluting this neighbourhood effect to some extent. And again, I think there's no kind of right or wrong answer here, but I think do have to be cautious. And my argument would be is if you're genuinely wanting to look at the neighbourhood effect, although in reality that neighbourhood effect could be actually partitioned back up to a higher level or to a lower level is interesting. I think maybe concentrating on just the neighbourhood is certainly a good starting point. Okay, so what are we going to do in this paper? So two kind of central hypotheses. So we're saying that living in a more deprived neighbourhood in childhood, or I should say more specifically at age 16, will be associated with a higher probability of having poor self-rated health in midlife. And that inequalities in self-rated health by childhood deprivation at midlife will widen as individuals age. So this is that idea of that fanning out, as we saw in the Ellaway analysis. So the data that we use to look at this are, as Paul and as Ola said, are birth cohort studies, British birth cohort studies from 1958 and 1970. And just to make it clear how we've actually done this data matching of Paul's data to these data, we had a lot of support from the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, who have actually done this linkage for us. And the way that has worked is that they, for every cohort study member in the 1950 and the 1970 cohort, going back to a certain point in time, I think back to 1974 in the 1958 cohort, and I think going back to 1980 in the 1970 cohort, they have a postcode centroid, which for some people it's directly taken from their postcode, but for those people that didn't provide postcodes at the earlier point in times, they've used other address information to create a centroid of where that individual was living at a certain study sweep. And then, fairly simply, we've used 2011 super output area boundaries and put everyone into one of those 2011 census output areas, and then matched Paul's data to that to give us this time series of neighbourhood deprivation at what I think is a fairly kind of novel thing to do within the literature, at this consistent boundaries across time. Should be fairly clear now, but our outcome measure is self-rated health, but itself is problematic, and Emily talked about this in her presentation in relation to the 1946 birth cohort study, that the way self-rated health is measured in the 58 and 70 cohort studies is not consistent, and it itself kind of raises some complications of making that comparison over time using the growth curve model. So as you can see here, so looking at NCDS, what's interesting, in fact both NCDS and BCS, is the framing of the question has actually changed subtly in most situations, but there's actually one sweep in BCS and NCDS where the framing of the question is actually quite radically different. But also what's different across each of the study sweeps is that the response categories that people tick as saying that their health is of a certain level has also changed over time. And because of those different response categories, that's what's made us to take the decision to dichotomise self-rated health into having good self-rated health, which we refer to having excellent, very good, or good, or whatever the variant is at that sweep, against having poor self-rated health. So that's having fair, poor, or very poor, or varying what was asked at the time point. And so just to focus your eyes on where I described that difference of the framing of the question. So in the 2004 sweep of NCDS and BCS, the question was quite different. So it asked people to determine their subjective self-rated health against people of their own age, and thinking back over the last 12 months. So we've talked kind of internally whether we should use these sweeps in our analysis, or whether we should do other things to deal with it. But I just want to kind of make that point clear, because it's in some of the descriptive trajectories. I think it explains why things are moving in certain directions over time. And then our main exposure is the Townsend Deprivation Index, as Paul described. I kind of don't need to go into any more depth about how that's derived. And the models that we fit separate models for the NCDS, the 1958 data, and the BCS 70 data, the 1970 birth cohort study data. And for those two data, we fit multi-level logistic growth curve models, where our level 1 is time, or here just taken as the age of the cohort study member, because the age of all the cohort study members will be the same at every sweep, because this is just single birth cohorts from 1958 and 1970. Our level 2 are the individuals, or to put in NCDS and BCS speak, the cohort members, and level 3 is our supered output area and the age 16 supered output area from NCDS and BCS. And what I'm going to show you, some results from a null model, from our variance components model, and some results from a random intercept model. We also tried to fit random slopes model on the age, but the models wouldn't converge. They were too complicated to work. And then our covariates are fairly limited actually at this point, because we've just not had time to really go much further, but also because I'm quite, and I think Owen, although he kind of described in terms of how these relationships might work, that we have a caution about what we should adjust for, and not wanting to, or certainly not going to that point of potentially going towards over adjustment. But the covariates that we do have in our model: gender, age, but again, remember age here is really kind of acting as being the study sweep identifier. Age squared. We have social class in childhood, measured at age 10 in the BCS data and age 11 in the NCDS data. And this social class refers to the father's occupation, or if not the father, the person who was, if it was a single parent family, then it would be taken as the mother's occupation. And then these are attached to social class schema, which were widely used at the time of these studies. So we haven't actually created these ourselves. And then we also add an interaction between the Townsend deprivation quintile and age, which enables us to determine that second, or answer that second research hypothesis about whether over time people who are living in more deprived contexts in childhood, are they likely to see an accelerated increase in the likelihood of reporting poor self-rated health? Or actually, in fact, what we're predicting here is actually reporting good self-rated health. So are they likely to see an accelerated decrease in the probability of reporting good self-rated health? Some descriptives just to show you how people kind of sat across the deprivation quintiles at the baseline measure when we look at their self-rated health. So this is at age 33 in the NCDS data, and unsurprisingly you see that a higher proportion of people who are living in less deprived neighbourhoods at age 16, a higher proportion of people living in less deprived neighbourhoods at age 16 reporting good self-rated health, compared to those living in the most deprived neighbourhoods at age 16. The magnitude of difference actually isn't quite as big as I was expecting. So on average, about 87% of people at age 33 in NCDS reporting their self-rated health as being good. In the BCS data, and this is not something that has come as a surprise to us, having been exposed to a lot of the cross-cohort study work that has been done using NCDS and BCS is showing that the BCS cohort doesn't appear to have as good, well, in relation to self-rated health, but we see it in a lot of other health measures as well, seem to generally have poorer health, and we can see that clearly there by the average proportion of people, regardless of their deprivation that they're experiencing at childhood. We see that a lower proportion of people in the 1970 cohort report having good self-rated health. And what's interesting, it seems as though the inequality across the deprivation quintile as measured at age 16 is also greater. So about 83% of people in the least deprived neighbourhoods in childhood reporting good self-rated health at age 34 in the BCS data, compared with only 75% of those living in the most deprived neighbourhoods at age 16. These are the descriptive trajectories, and forgive me for the poor labelling here. This is again a problem because we've rushed these analyses, and just also just to say is the way that we have to conduct these analyses is actually using a system within the UK data service called the Secure Lab, which basically is a setting that UKDS require anyone that's using any information which might be deemed as confidential in any way, shape or form, and it requires you to access a server from your desktop machine, which has to be located within your institution. So I can only use this at my desk at work, and then I have to log into this system and then do all my analysis and then submit that analysis for approval, and then the people at the UKDS then approve those data or those outputs if they think they meet statistical disclosure and if they think you're translating them in a way that's clear, which I think maybe here they must have let this one slip.
The less clarity, the better.
But anyway, the top line there refers to people who are living in the least deprived neighbourhood at age 16, and the bottom line there refers to people living in the most deprived area at 16. And so what we see in the NCDS cohort over the NCDS sweep, so as the people get older, is that up to the age 50, there seems to be a downward trajectory in reporting good self-rated health, and then between 50 and 55, there seems this upward turn in that more people report good self-rated health at age 55 compared with at age 50. Interestingly, in the BCS data, we see kind of an inverse relationship in that between 34 and 38, it seems people seem to get slightly more likely to report good self-rated health, and then there is somewhat of a downward trajectory up to age 42. But just to remember, this, I think, is the point at which we're measuring self-rated health differently, where the framing of the question is very different compared with the later years. And so really, I think maybe it's worth kind of concentrating here. And looking here, it's actually quite interesting, just from the descriptive analysis, that actually we do start to see this fanning out. So the people living in the most deprived neighbourhoods are seeing an accelerated decrease in their probability of reporting good self-rated health compared with people living in the least disadvantaged neighbourhoods at age 16. I'm going to go past that in the interest of time and actually go on to the statistical analysis. So here what we have is our norm model, our variance components model, where we have no explanatory variables, simply predicting the outcome and then partitioning at the different levels. And what we see here, and I was really interested by your median odds ratio. When reading your paper, I didn't quite understand it, but yesterday I think I do now. And so that's something that I think will be really interesting actually for us to apply. But we've taken a kind of much kind of cruder way of actually looking at the variance. And remember, again, here we have a binary outcome, so we're fitting logistic regression models. So Ruth was suggesting that that may lead to kind of underestimation of your variance at the higher levels. But that kind of maybe doesn't matter so much. I mean, this is our level 1, this is our level 2 and level 3. And so what's kind of really interesting is, I think, is how the variance is partitioned between these two levels, between the neighbourhood and between the individual. And we see that the individual variation, as you would expect, is greater than the neighbourhood variation, but a lot greater. So if we partition the variance at each level, assuming that that's the variance at the time point, then we see about 2% of the variance in self-rated health is unexplained at the LSOA or at the neighbourhood level. Then when we add our covariance to model, what happens to the proportion of the variance we explain at the LSOA, at the neighbourhood level? So I'm going to talk first about the BCS data because it seems a little bit more logical. So when we add our gender, our Townsend, our age squared term, on our interaction, we explain about 44% of that 2% variance at the neighbourhood level. When we add on father social class, explain about another 8% of 8 percentage points of the variation as well. So explain slightly more than half of the variation. Something a bit weird is going on with the NCDS analysis, and I'm not quite sure what's happened here. So if anyone's kind of got any ideas, I'd be really interested to hear. So in the first step, as we saw in the same explanatory variables added as in the BCS model, explain almost the vast majority of the variation at the neighbourhood level. When we add father social class, actually the variance at the neighbourhood level actually increases, and actually increases beyond what it even originally was in the null model. So I'm not quite sure really what's going on there, whether we've just done something fairly obvious wrong, or whether that's a kind of that estimate is actually likely to be anywhere correct. In terms of the fixed effects, I don't really need to detail these, but I'm just going to focus on the two that really answer our research hypothesis. So this one here, so this is actually just a linear term of the Townsend quintile, and so we have here odds ratio. So the fact this odds ratio is lower than 1, that's showing that if you live in a more deprived neighbourhood at age 16, you're less likely to report good self-rated health. And then the other term that enables us to answer our research hypothesis is this interaction between age and Townsend deprivation quintile, and that's slightly above 1, but you can see there it's not significant. But what that is, if we believe that direction of the hypothesis, then that would actually be kind of converse to what we expected. That's actually saying that as you get older, living in a more deprived neighbourhood, you're more likely to report good self-rated health, so it kind of goes against the hypothesis. For BCS, pretty much all the fixed effects actually are very similar, particularly in relation to the Townsend deprivation. So again, living in a more deprived neighbourhood at age 16 means you're less likely to report good self-rated health at age 34 and onwards. And interestingly here, for the age Townsend deprivation quintile interaction, the odds ratio is in the direction that we would expect, that those people who live in more deprived neighbourhoods, over time they become less likely to report good self-rated health. So an indication of the finding out, but again here the confidence intervals, or the credible confidence intervals from the MCMC estimation show that the confidence intervals go through 1. And then this is actually very similar to what I showed you for the descriptive statistics, but these are the predicted probabilities from our full model, so including all the explanatory variables that I detailed before. So here is for NCDS, and so we can see here at baseline, and again poorly labelled, but it's fairly obvious, the bottom line is people living in the most deprived neighbourhoods, and the top line is people living in the least deprived neighbourhoods, and then the ordered values in between. And so at baseline, what you can see is living in a more deprived neighbourhood at baseline, you're less likely to report good self-rated health, and that difference as people age through the NCDS cohort remains quite similar. So there isn't the fanning out which we might have expected. Pretty much the same for women in the NCDS cohort. For BCS, here we do see a little bit of the fanning out, and again it follows very similar relationship as we saw in the descriptive analysis, but when controlling for the limited number of explanatory variables, we still kind of see that to some extent. So by way of conclusion, what we're showing here is we find when we're predicting this measure of good self-rated health, we have a small variation at the neighbourhood level. We largely explain that using the Townsend deprivation index. We find that people living in deprived neighbourhoods at age 16 have poorer self-rated health at midlife, but the disparities in self-rated health as people age don't widen by the level of neighbourhood deprivation that you're experiencing in childhood.